21 hours. That is how long the first direct negotiations between American and Iranian officials since the Islamic Revolution of 1979 lasted. 21 hours. And then they collapsed. And what happened next is why you need to be watching this right now, tonight, before the markets open tomorrow. President Trump did not go back to the status quo. He escalated. The United States Navy has been ordered to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, not to reopen it, to seal it. A complete blockade. His words, all or none. No ship passes until Iran relents. CENTCOM has confirmed the blockade begins enforcement tomorrow morning, April 13th, at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is not a threat. This is an operational order with a start time. The most important maritime choke point on Earth, 20% of the world's oil, is now closed not by one side, but by both. Iran minded. America is now blockading it. This is not a negotiating tactic. This is a fundamental change in the architecture of this crisis. And the historical comparison that fits, the only one that truly fits, is Cuba, 1962. Let me explain why and what it means for you. Vice President Vance, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner sat across from Iran's Parliament Speaker, Ghalibaf, and Foreign Minister, Arghachi, for 21 consecutive hours. Pakistan's Prime Minister Sharif mediated. The talks broke on irreconcilable demands. And there were more of them than you have probably heard. First, nuclear enrichment. The U.S. demanded what Vance called an affirmative commitment that Iran not seek a nuclear weapon and will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve one. Iran refused, flatly. Their nuclear chief had already said publicly that any restriction on enrichment was, his words, quote, merely wishes that will be buried, end quote. Second, Lebanon. Iran demanded a cessation of Israeli strikes against Hezbollah as part of any deal. The United States could not deliver that. Israel had already made clear, with its largest strikes in Beirut since the war began, launched during the ceasefire no less, that Lebanon was not covered. Third, and this is the one most Western media is underplaying, Iran demanded control of the Strait of Hormuz and payment for war reparations. These are not negotiating positions. These are maximalist demands designed to be rejected. Tehran came to Islamabad to perform a negotiation, not to conduct one. Vance said, and I quote, "They have chosen not to accept our terms," end quote. Neither side left the door open. Both walked out. Now, what happened next? Within hours of the collapse, Trump posted, quote, effective immediately, the United States Navy, the finest in the world, will begin the process of blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz, end quote. He called it all or none, no exceptions. No humanitarian corridor mentioned, no exceptions for Allied shipping. He also ordered the Navy to seek and interdict any and every vessel in international waters that has paid a toll to Iran and to destroy the mines Iran laid in the strait. So let me be precise about what this means, because precision matters here in particular. A blockade is not a patrol. Under international law, a blockade is an act of war. The United States is now asserting the right to stop, board, and potentially seize any vessel transiting one of the most critical waterways on the planet. And this is where the Cuban Missile Crisis parallel becomes structural, not rhetorical. In October 1962, President John F. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade he called a quarantine around Cuba to force the Soviet Union to withdraw its nuclear missiles. The world held its breath for 13 days. Khrushchev blinked, not because the Soviet Union lacked will, but because the naval balance in the Caribbean was overwhelming, and because Moscow calculated that the stakes did not justify the risk of nuclear war. Trump is making a comparable bet. The naval balance in the Strait of Hormuz is just as asymmetric as it was in the Caribbean in 1962. Iran does not have a blue water navy capable of testing a U.S. blockade. It has fast boats, mines, and coastal missiles that can inflict casualties, just as Castro defenses could have, but they cannot break a blockade. And here is what few people will acknowledge, but serious analysts must. The blockade is the restrained option. Trump could have resumed bombing. He could have ordered strikes on Iran's remaining infrastructure, its ports, its power grid. The Joint Chiefs almost certainly presented that option. He chose economic strangulation over kinetic escalation, just as Kennedy chose quarantine over the airstrike his generals recommended. That does not make the blockade safe. Kennedy's quarantine brought the world closer to annihilation than any other moment in human history. But it was the disciplined choice, the option that applied maximum pressure while preserving space for the other side to calculate, reconsider, and ultimately yield. The question is whether Iran's post-Khamenei leadership has the coherence to make that calculation. Let me be direct about the balance of forces, because clarity serves leaders better than false equivalence. Iran is structurally weaker than any adversary that has faced an American blockade in modern history. The supreme leader is essentially dead. The leadership structure is fragmented. The economy was on life support before the war. Inflation, unemployment, currency collapse. The nuclear program, which was their ultimate bargaining chip, has been significantly degraded by the American and Israeli strikes. The enriched uranium stockpile, hundreds of kilograms of near weapons-grade material, is buried under rubble at bombed sites. Iran's military cannot contest the U.S. Navy in the open water of the Gulf. Their asymmetric capabilities, mines, fast attack boats, anti-ship missiles, are real but limited. They can make the blockade costly. They cannot break it. And the coalition dynamics work against Tehran. China helped broker the ceasefire, yes, but China has not committed to opposing the blockade. Japan and Australia have already said they will not send ships. No major power has publicly stood beside Iran against this move. Compare that to Cuba, where the Soviet Union was the direct patron, with nuclear submarines and strategic missiles in the theater. Iran has no equivalent patron willing to risk confrontation with the U.S. Navy. The probable outcome, and I emphasize probable, not certain, is that Iran eventually yields, not because it wants to, but because the mathematics of the situation compel it. A landlocked, economically strangled, leadership fractured state cannot outlast an open-ended naval blockade by the world's dominant maritime power. But, and this is the critical caveat, the question is not whether Iran loses this standoff. It is how much damage Iran inflicts on the way down, and who else gets caught in the blast radius. Now, let me show you what this looks like from every other capital that matters. China is in the most uncomfortable position. Why? Simple. 80% of Gulf oil goes to Asia. A U.S. blockade of the strait is, from Beijing's perspective, an American hand on China's energy windpipe. If China interprets this as unilateral seizure of the global energy artery, the response will go far beyond the Middle East. It will accelerate de-dollarization, alternative supply chains, strategic decoupling, every trend Beijing has been building towards for the better part of a decade. Wang Yi made 26 calls to broker the ceasefire. Those calls just failed. Watch what Beijing does next. Russia benefits enormously from this situation. Every day the strait stays closed, Russian oil and gas becomes more valuable and more necessary. European dependence on non-Gulf energy, including Russian pipelines, Europe spent 4 years trying to quit, increases. A prolonged blockade is the single best thing that could happen to Russia's economy and geopolitical position. Europe is in crisis. The EU fossil fuel import bill was already up 14 billion euros. Gas prices up 70%. A blockade eliminates even the trickle of supply that was getting through. Europe faces energy rationing, industrial slowdowns, and a political crisis that will test the cohesion of the Union. And Europe has no seat at this table whatsoever. That makes things ever more complicated. Israel views this as validation. The collapse of talks removes diplomatic pressure on Lebanon, and the blockade economically strangles their primary regional adversary. But Netanyahu must calculate how long global tolerance for high energy prices lasts before it turns against the war itself and fundamentally against the United States and Israel. 3 trajectories. Prepare for all of them. 1. Rapid re-engagement. The blockade works as pressure. Iran returns to the table within days, makes concessions. This is the White House bet. It's possible, precisely because Iran is so weak, but it's not the most likely outcome in the short term. Iran's domestic politics, especially in post-Khamenei power vacuum, reward defiance. 2. Protracted standoff. The blockade holds. Iran doesn't return. The strait stays closed for weeks, possibly months. Oil stabilizes between 120 and 140. The global economy enters a structural energy crisis. This is the most probable trajectory. 3. Escalation. Iran responds militarily, attacks on U.S. naval assets, resumed missile strikes, proxy activation in Iraq, Syria, the Gulf. The U.S. resumes bombing. Oil exceeds $150 a barrel. Global recession. This is a tail risk. It is no longer remote. Oil futures have already jumped 7% tonight as of this posting. That is the opening move. If the blockade is enforced, $120 within the week is the baseline, not the upside scenario. Let me leave you with this. The window that opened with the ceasefire 5 days ago is now closed. What replaces it is not another window. It is a blockade, in the literal and strategic sense. The probable arc of this crisis follows the Cuban precedent. The weaker party, unable to sustain this standoff, eventually yields. But the path between the start of a blockade and its resolution runs through the most dangerous terrain geopolitics can offer. At 10 o'clock tomorrow morning Eastern, CENTCOM begins enforcement. Monday morning will not be the resolution. It will be the beginning of the reckoning. Every decision maker watching this should be asking essentially 3 questions tonight. What is my direct exposure to a Strait of Hormuz closed for 60 to 90 days? What is my indirect exposure through supply chains, customers, and financial counterparties? And what is my plan if the answer to both questions is worse than I thought? The era of assuming that 20% of the world's oil flows freely through a narrow strait ended on February 28th. Today, it was buried. Prepare accordingly.